women in those hunter-gatherer type populations don't have increased rates of obesity or heart disease, or they are quite healthy compared to sort of women in the West. And there are a lot of ideas swirling around on why. And one of them has to do actually with the reproductive years and lifestyle during your reproductive years.
I'm Anne Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hop, I think.
You're all woman to me. All right, Anne Marie.
My guest today is Dr. Deena Emera, an evolutionary geneticist and author of A Brief History of the Female Body, an evolutionary look at how and why the female form came to be. She currently serves as a senior scientist at the Buck Institute's Buck Center for Healthy Aging in Women, and we're going to talk all about her work there, and I'm going to dive into the genetic basis of reproductive longevity in mammals. And how did we start to menopause and why and how has it changed and all of the things. I cannot wait to speak to Deena, who is a mother of four and a biologist and has written a really illuminating book if you get a chance to read it. An evolutionary geneticist, can you just describe to us what that work involves?
Yes. So I'm interested in evolution and more specifically, how do bodies change over time? How and why, but I've always focused a little bit more on the how. So what I mean by that is, what are the types of changes in DNA that lead to big changes in bodies over long periods of time? As an example, I spent a lot of time during my PhD work studying the evolution of pregnancy. What does that mean? The first mammals laid eggs. Then mammals started doing this other really cool thing, which is growing their babies inside their bodies. How do those types of changes happen at the genetic level? So, a lot of what I do is comparing the genomes of different mammals. A lot of my work is in mammals. Doesn't need to be. People study other taxa, but study mammals. So a lot of what I do is compare different mammals and specifically the DNA of these mammals. And there's usually a trait I'm interested in. Right now, I'm really interested in menopause and the lack of menopause in some species that live a very long time. And so I'm interested in the sort of DNA changes that lead to those traits. And the way you get at that, or one of the ways you can get at that, especially traits that aren't captured in the fossil record. If you're studying the evolution of bipedalism in humans, you are fortunate to be able to look at the fossil pelvis from ancestral humans and make inferences. We can't do that for traits like menopause or pregnancy or any soft tissue, parts of the body or behavior. You have to use other clues like DNA and differences in DNA between mammals that allow you to make inferences about maybe what the ancestral species looked like in terms of their DNA. And so
it was like a scientific informed slight guessing game.
Yes, something like that. And ideally, you can develop a hypothesis and then you can go test it. If you're really interested in this piece of DNA that you think, as an example, was involved in the evolution of the human hand. And this is not a random example. I spent some of my postdoc very interested in this one piece of DNA that we thought was involved in human hand evolution. You can take that piece of DNA and you can manipulate a mouse genome so that that sequence in the mouse, you can replace it with the sequence that humans have. And you can look for differences in the development of the mouse hand to test your hypothesis that this important sequence was involved in human hand evolution, as an example. So you develop a hypothesis and then ideally you go test it in some way. You have to be creative, obviously, about how to test it, but yeah.
That's fascinating. And one thing I loved about your book as you're reading through it, you have chapters on stuff we all like to think about, like breasts and why do we have breasts and why do we have orgasms, you laid out all these theories. And like for orgasms, the one that I was like, oh, that's right, the suck it up theory. Like we have an orgasm so we can suck the sperm up and then, but then you talked about how there's other suggestions that women have ways of not getting pregnant if they're not fans of the people that they've just had sex with.
Yeah.
And other species that have that. And breasts, like all the different theories for why we have breasts, not just when we reproduce, why they stick around. And it was fascinating because there's all these people putting through all these theories, and then you go through them and say, man, this is why, and this is why. So it's so crazy. And then when you come along and you examine it, what happens to those other theories? What happens to the people who came up with the suck it up theory for why we may have an
Yeah.
orgasm during sex to help us get the sperm up, which isn't, I just, that one stuck out. I'm sure it sticks out for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know about all the people who have developed theories that have lost favor over time. As evolutionary biologists, you're constantly coming up with ideas, and some of them do end up being wrong. And that doesn't mean you're a bad scientist, or it just means you had this idea and it was tested and it ended up not being the right interpretation of the evolution of that trait. So as an example, I did a lot of work on the evolution of menstruation, and there's a lot of ideas out there on why menstruation evolved. Is it adaptive? Is it a byproduct? And some very respected anthropologists came up with ideas, and then people then went on to test them, and there wasn't a lot of support for that idea. It's not like they're now shunned. They continue to do research,
Mhm.
but so this is a part of science. Some of like that upsuck hypothesis, there were some, I don't know those scientists, and my reading of the literature is that some shady things happened in developing those ideas and testing the idea. As long as you're doing legitimate science, I think you're good. But if you're fabricating data, that obviously doesn't look good to the scientific community.
If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know I'm a root cause girl at heart. And when we dive into what makes us function, you get right down to our mitochondria. They are like the battery pack for our cells. That means they're our power source. And don't you want to do a little house cleaning on your power source? MitoPure by Timeline contains a rare postbiotic urothalin A, and it works by promoting a process of cellular cleanup that clears out dysfunctional mitochondria. MitoPure's own testing has shown improvements in energy levels, recovery time, endurance, and more. Timeline is offering 10% off your order of MitoPure. Go to timeline.com/hotflash. That's timeline.com/hotflash.
Yeah, it's interesting too how long, because the information gets out and then we know it gets repeated and repeated. So it takes so long to be corrected. It took all the way until I read your book for me to not think that was true. That makes a lot of sense, right? Like common sense. You think, oh yeah.
Yes.
But so that's really interesting to me in all sorts of areas.
Yes. And actually, I'm sure we'll get into talking about menopause, but there's a lot of heated discussion about the evolution of menopause. And you think that the matter has been settled, whatever the issue is, we can get into it. And then someone comes out. One of the big debates is how frequent, how common is menopause in the animal world? And there has been a lot of work on how to define menopause and what the trait that we're talking about really is. And anyway, I thought that the matter was settled, but then someone comes along like last year and writes a paper and says, wait a minute, no, menopause happens very frequently in animals. And so it's frustrating because you have scientists from different disciplines who aren't necessarily this latest paper that said menopause is very common. The people who wrote it were not evolutionary biologists. So
Just to stop so people know what we're talking about. It's
yes,
like
sorry.
a paper that was published by two German researchers, and it was published in Nature, I believe. And it said, hey, actually 80% of mammals may go through menopause. And so, yeah, so I'm interested to hear, sorry, am I right in describing that paper?
So I think the paper was in Cell, actually.
Oh, Cell, okay.
But yeah, another big journal. those authors, I don't know the authors, but I know that they're not evolutionary biologists. And I appreciate the effort, but really they were ignoring a whole body of literature that talks about how, the sort of the appropriate tests that you need to do to study this question. So as an example, they looked at most of the populations they studied were captive animals.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know about animals in captivity is because of reduced mortality rates, there's no predation in a zoo. They live longer than their sort of counterparts in the wilds. And so that is going to inflate this sort of post-menopausal period. Any mammal can go through menopause. This is a source of the confusion. All mammals and birds are set up to possibly go through menopause because we make all our eggs up front. So if you live long enough, you will go through menopause. The issue is it typical in that species for the females to live long enough? And if you only are looking at animals in captivity, then you're going to see post-menopausal females fairly frequently. The question is, in the wild, how often does that happen? It's going to happen just by chance, right? Some females are going to live beyond the age where they can reproduce anymore. That's going to happen. But the real question is, how often does that happen in natural living conditions? And what percentage of life is it? Is it a few months? Is it a few? Is it a real, in other words, is this a real life history stage? Or is this just this chance event that you're capturing? So anyway, the German authors of this study ignore this big body of literature describing this test statistic. It's called post-reproductive representation, but essentially it controls for these things that we're talking about. You're really looking at how frequent is this trait. It's not really the trait of menopause, it's the trait of this long post-reproductive period. That's really the trait we're talking about. So how frequent is that in your population? It's really like a population measure. It's not, oh, that one female over there stopped reproducing a year ago. So menopause exists in that species, right? That's not, that's, that's misleading, I would say. It's confusing. So we have ways of really measuring how frequent is this trait in this population, and is it like a significant part of their life that they're spending in this life stage? So all of that to say, these debates continue, even though, you think the matter's settled. Someone comes along and says, well, wait a minute, menopause is, this, not menopause, but a post-reproductive life stage. It's really common. But they've ignored a whole body of literature that really digs into how we can appropriately measure that.
It's not common if you're not alive to experience it.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're not here, we really shouldn't be talking about it. So when it comes to animals, because I have seen studies on, I got into this when I early was researching, and I'm learning from you and others that it's more complicated, obviously, which is always the risk as a journalist because you get a little bit of information. But giraffes, elephants, camels, even.
In my reading of the literature, and by the way, this is not my area of expertise. I'm not going out and
You didn't read the book.
measuring post-reproductive representation in these species. This is like a niche thing that many scientists are doing. But in my reading of the literature, it's few species, not including giraffes, not including elephants. The studies that say that those species experience menopause, I think, aren't using that test statistic that I was describing. So it's basically humans and a handful of whales, a handful of toothed whales.
Well, okay.
Yeah, so like the elephant data that I've seen suggests to me that that elephants continue reproducing until close to the end of their life. So they're not, again, maybe a few elephants in captivity are living beyond the age that they stop reproducing, but in the wilds, at the level of the population, they keep going till close to the end.
Okay. That's really interesting. Okay. So I could talk about that all day, but it's not your, it's my thing that I'm obsessed with, but I'm working through it because I like to know about my cat and dogs. There was a vet in England who said dogs go through it.
That's interesting. But I would say, again, dogs dogs in our homes have a very different life than dogs duking it out in the streets of Cairo.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh boy, do they ever. Yeah. Okay. Just to get really broad, what are from your research and the research you're doing? And I want to talk about the Buck Institute later, but what are your theories on why we menopause, why we do menopause?
Okay. Yep. That's a good question and broad. So, again, just like to be clear about it, the trait that I'm really talking about is not menopause exactly. So, the reason we go through menopause, like, again, to be really clear, is because we have this system of this unique, kind of strange system of setting up our eggs up front, right?
Yep.
So, menopause is going to happen if you live long enough. And
Because
so,
because we're born with all the immature eggs that we're ever going to have.
exactly.
Okay.
So humans are born with 1 million eggs. These are very rough numbers. And at menopause, you haven't lost all of them, but you're down to like less than 1,000. So you have essentially run out of eggs at menopause. And this we see this pattern in other species. You make your in other mammalian and actually bird species. You make your eggs up front, and we have this complex system of going through those eggs. And when you've gone through them all, you go through menopause. And so, what's unique in humans is not so much that menopause happens. That's not what's surprising. What's surprising is that we have this long this long life stage after reproduction has ended. So, that's, in my opinion, that's really the interesting trait. Because if you look at our closest animal relatives, chimpanzees, they also go through menopause around 50. The difference is that most chimps die before that point. There is a really interesting population of chimps that has been recently studied in Uganda that actually the females in that population live longer. It's a wild population of chimps. I'm not sure if you've seen this study, but the females are living into their 60s. And it's not just one, there's a number of them, which is really interesting and I think will really help us better understand how menopause evolved in humans. So, anyway, my point in bringing that up is we think the ancestral trait, like the trait of menopause at 50, we inherited from our ape ancestors. And so, really, what we need to understand is why humans started living so much longer. And there are so many ideas, and you can group them into two categories, or that's how I do it in my own head. You've got the non-adaptive theories and the adaptive theories. So the non-adaptive theories argue that this longer lifespan didn't evolve for a specific reason. It didn't evolve by natural selection. Menopause exists as like a byproduct of something else. Let me give you a concrete example. Some people have argued that lifespan didn't actually get longer until the last couple hundred years.
Oh, this is my another favorite topic. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll show this chart of sort of life expectancy over the decades. And when you look at the chart, it is very misleading. Yeah, in the 1800s, it was on the 30s, 40s, and then it gradually increased, and then it's plateaued at about 80 in like recent decades. And so, as this non adaptive argument goes, the only reason women go through menopause now is because of sort of modern medicine and sanitation. So we have artificially extended our lives with those cultural innovations. And so menopause was uncovered as a result.
We all used to die at
that's
50. We all used to die at 50. That's what you hear people saying.
Exactly. This is like a huge pet peeve of mine, especially when it's a scientist who is touting this idea and saying, let's go through what the science says, and they show the chart. And so anyway, if there's anything you take away from this, anything your listeners take away from this, It's very easy to look at a chart like that and jump to the conclusion that women all died before 50 in the 1800s and before. But really what that chart is showing you is an average life expectancy at birth. And it's an average. And the reason the average was so low before vaccines and antibiotics is that a lot of little babies and children died. And so those deaths drove the average way down. And so we know by studying all these hunter-gatherer populations around the globe that don't have access to medicine or sanitation, we know that if you make it to adulthood, you have a very good chance as a woman of living not just to the age of menopause, which is around 50, but decades beyond that. This is, again, a huge pet peeve of mine, usually because whoever is using that misleading chart has some sort of agenda. And they're trying to push that agenda by this very misleading chart. So,
Yeah.
again,
They're also not doing much deep thinking, because that would mean there were no old women or grandmothers to match the old men and grandfathers that we had around. It would
yes.
just be all old men and no old women in history. And we know that's not true. And you can walk
Yes.
through a cemetery. I'm sorry, I've said this a million times. It's my pet peeve too. It's so nice to meet someone who has the same pet peeve.
Yes. And usually, more recently, the agenda has been menopause is a disease and you should treat it with hormone therapy, let's say. I'm not against hormone therapy. I'm in my mid late 40s. It's something that I'm actively thinking about. So it's not that I am against the idea of taking hormones, but I am against the idea of dumbing down the reality of the data because people think that women can't handle nuance. Because then when they find out the real story, they're like, wait a minute, I was missold.
It's not even dumbing it down. It's like completely, yeah, it's completely misrepresenting and misleading people.
Yes.
It's really quite nefarious. If it bothers me on two fronts. We're going off on a tangent, but it's favorite pet peeve. It bothers me on two fronts, because if people know and they're misrepresenting it, that's irresponsible and I think evil.
Yes.
And if people don't know and they're speaking it confidently, as I have seen scientists and doctors do,
Yes.
and they don't know,
Yes.
that disturbs me even more, because people are
Yes.
hanging on their every word and they're making
Yes.
decisions based on. So either one is really not cool.
Totally. I totally agree.
Okay.
I totally agree. And as an evolutionary biologist, I don't believe menopause is a disease. I truly believe that it is this stage after menopause is like an evolved feature of human life. It is part of our life history. Now, does that mean that our experience, the transition, all of that, does that mean that in this modern context, we shouldn't be treating the symptoms that would, of course not. But I feel like we need to get the details. We need to understand what we're working with before we start throwing medication at the problem, right?
Yeah, particularly because we know. If it was just a matter of we didn't know yet, but we all should know better about that at this point.
Yes.
And yeah, so that's great. We'll spread that. We'll keep talking about that. I don't know when we'll stop being obsessed with it. But you brought up a great point about this sort of mismatch idea, that
Yes.
rather than this being some sort of situation that needs to be corrected, we were born with some deficiency to crap out at 50 and just us, not men. Perhaps the situation has to do with other things. So the environment and our pace of our life and other things. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And people have studied this. I wouldn't say that we're at a very advanced stage of understanding this mismatch, but it's definitely there. So, when you look at women around the globe and you look at sort of their experience through the transition. We know that there's variation. We know that some women have a harder time than others. When you look around the globe at rates of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, those disease risk factors that sort of shoot up after you've gone through menopause. Again, when you look around the globe, there's variation in rates of those diseases in that postmenopausal state. And women in those hunter-gatherer type populations don't have increased rates of obesity or heart disease, or they are quite healthy compared to sort of women in the West. And there are a lot of ideas swirling around on why. And one of them has to do actually with the reproductive years and lifestyle during your reproductive years. For example, we know that in those hunter-gatherer populations, they're pregnant a lot, they're nursing a lot. We know that they have different diets. We know, so if they have much higher fiber diets, lower fat diets. We know that they exercise a lot more. And the other thing we know about those lifestyle factors is that they suppress estrogen. So, so they have all these lifestyle differences. They also have lower estrogen levels during their reproductive years. Women in the West have elevated estrogen compared to these more natural fertility populations. And so one of the ideas is that if you prime the body during those reproductive years to need a lot of estrogen around, then at menopause, estrogen levels plummet in anyone going through menopause. Basically, at menopause, your ovaries, they don't die completely or stop completely, but they really shut down production of estrogen. If you prime the body to like need a lot of estrogen, then when you take that estrogen away, the idea is that the body has a harder time dealing with that change versus if the body has a much more moderate level of estrogen during those reproductive years, that decline in estrogen at menopause isn't such a big deal, right? And that is totally consistent with the symptoms that those women, or the lack thereof, like there are really many fewer symptoms during the transition. And then those rates of all of those diseases that shoot way up in the West after menopause.
And when you talk about higher levels of estrogen, that's because of our environment, because of estrogenic things in the environment. Is that why? Or
I think it's a combination of things. I think estrogenic things in the environment contribute. I think a very high fat, meaty diet is correlated with higher estrogen levels. We know, for example, very competitive athletes in the West have lower estrogen. So there is also something about exercise. If you are constantly exercising, that seems to suppress estrogen levels. I don't know that we have all the mechanisms and details worked out, but there are definitely these, correlations. And I think something really worth exploring. Now, what are you going to do? Tell women to like stay? So I also mentioned sort of fertility. If you're pregnant, you have naturally low levels of estrogen being suppressed. When you're lactating, estrogen's being suppressed. And so that is one reason, right? Like women in these natural fertility populations are basically spending a huge chunk of their life either pregnant or nursing. And they're just exposed to a lot less estrogen. They're not cycling as much as we are. Is the solution going to be like tell women to stay pregnant and nursing? No, obviously not.
not in these times, Deena, not in these times.
Not in these times.
But you did mention, just to interrupt you, you mentioned in your book sort of an ideal situation in the hunter-gatherer, a woman who's having her last baby in her 40s, and then she's breastfeeding, and then she just like slips into later perimenopause, and it's not like this jolt.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, no. Again, I don't know how well this has been studied, but it makes total sense to me. When you look at those hunter-gatherer populations, a lot of the women in those populations are nursing their last baby into their 40s. And maybe they'll nurse that last baby longer than earlier children. And so she's obviously not ovulating during that time. She's suppressing estrogen. She's also producing these other hormones like oxytocin and prolactin, which make you feel good, right? And so the idea is that perhaps she's buffering herself against some of those negative effects of declining estrogen that women in the West experience, right?
Okay.
Presumably she's not experiencing that chaotic, hormone chaos of perimenopause because she is suppressing her ovaries, right? She's suppressing the estrogen production and ovulation. And she's also producing these other hormones that make you feel good. Yeah, I think that could be contributing to why women in those hunter-gatherer populations report fewer or no symptoms in the transition.
It's a weird
Absolutely.
thing because it is all about your hormones, but it's not all about your hormones. Because if it was all about your hormones and only your hormones, it would be the same for everyone. Maybe. I don't know. It's very
Yeah.
difficult.
I think I will say that I think our bodies have evolved to be somewhat flexible. So this idea that during the reproductive years, your body, if you've got low estrogen, your lower estrogen because you're exercising every day, because you have a very high fiber diet, you're always pregnant. I think that affects how your body deals with a low estrogen environment later. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's flexibility built into the system, right? It's not like your genes say that this is going to happen. Our bodies are meant to adapt to fluctuating environmental conditions.
Yeah.
If you're eating a lot and there's an abundance of food, maybe that's the time to reproduce and estrogen goes up a bit. If there's not a lot of food around, your body suppresses the estrogen production and that's adaptive, right? This is not the right time to reproduce because you're not going to be able to support that baby.
That's really
Anyway, these are nuances that I think are important to understanding why our bodies do what they do. We got to understand the context in which they evolved and why our bodies are set up this way.
okay. So tell me about the work that you're doing at the Buck Institute on menopause, and then I'll ask you a few more questions about the future.
Sure. So at the Buck is a research institute of aging. We're very interested in the mechanisms of aging, how we age. Instead of many people focus on specific diseases, but we know that aging is like the biggest risk factor for all of these diseases. And so we really want to tackle like why aging happens and how it's happening. And we have a center that's focused specifically on aging of the female reproductive system. That started somewhat recently in 20. It has been renamed recently. The new name is the Center for Healthy Aging in Women. And part of the reason we renamed it is, before it had the word reproductive in it. And we're trying to move away from this idea that the ovaries are only reproductive organs, because that is a little bit misleading. Obviously, they're very important for reproductive health and reproductive function. The ovaries produce hormones that talk to the entire body, your brain, fat tissue, muscle tissue, blood vessel. It's estrogen talks to everyone in the body. And yeah, so the center is focused on the mechanisms of reproductive aging in women. Why are ovaries aging? How are they aging? Why do they age faster than other tissues in the body? And there are folks who are studying these topics from totally different angles. Mine is probably the most different. As an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in questions about human health. That's not totally what drives my passion. As I described when we first started talking, I'm interested in mechanisms of evolution. So how do bodies change over time? You always need to pick a body part, or you need to pick a system to study. And I've spent a lot of my career studying the female reproductive system. And so now I'm focused on menopause, and the way that I'm approaching it, again, which is a little bit different from most of my colleagues, is looking to nature. So basically, I look at the animal world. Really, I'm looking at mammals, and I'm asking the question, has any mammal solved this issue of menopause? Not that I want to describe it as a problem. It's this thing that happens, And we're trying to better understand why it happens and potentially delay when it happens. The idea is that maybe instead of taking hormone therapy, is there a way to encourage your ovaries to stay healthier for a little bit longer? And again, it's not really or only about reproduction. It's really mainly about health, right? Angle that I'm taking is, are there animals that have done this naturally, that have extended their reproductive lives, that extended the health of their ovaries for a long time? And so the species, I'm interested in a couple of species. The species I'm really interested in are bowhead whales. They're well known for being the longest lived mammal as far as we know. I think there's a lot more work to be done on cetaceans. It's hard to study them. So I think there are other whales that are also very long lived, but bowheads are famous. They can live over 200 years. And what's interesting to me about them from the sort of reproductive aging angle is that we have evidence that females can reproduce into their second century of life. So there are Native Americans and also in Canada and Russia, and these whales live in the Arctic. And so there are native groups up there that hunt the whales for subsistence. And so we have some information on them. A female was hunted who was 130 and she was pregnant. So this female bowhead, and we don't know how typical this is. I mean, we do have a little bit more data than like an N of one. We have evidence that these females are continuing to ovulate again into their second century of life. So they seem to have been able to keep their ovaries healthy for a longer period of time. So I'm interested in how they managed to do that. This is not an easy question. It requires getting ovaries from these whales, which I have been trying desperately to do for the last 2 years. It's very challenging. I still don't have the tissue. I don't know if I will ever get it.
Oh my gosh, like you
But
just have to wait for one to wash up on shore? Or
no,
do you have to capture it and do an
no.
oophorectomy?
It's if that was the only way to do it, I probably wouldn't have gone down this path. Like I mentioned, there are people who actively hunt these animals.
Okay, true.
Whaling is illegal, but if you're doing it for subsistence and cultural purposes,
Okay.
it's legal. So really it's a question of I've been up to Alaska twice now talking to the tribes who hunt these whales, trying to convince them to share some of the tissue. They don't eat the ovaries, but understandably they're very suspicious of outsiders,
Yeah.
scientists. So
This is
anyway,
fascinating. Like you've spent time going up to Alaska saying, yo, just like next time you get one of these, could you just?
it's like better than
Oh,
that. I think they've got ovaries in the freezer. I think a lot of the tissue's already there because
oh
there
my
is a
gosh.
research institute up there that they essentially work for the whalers. It's a long story. It's really interesting. And the whalers it's been one of the most fascinating experiences of my life, like going up there,
Yeah.
interacting with them. They're wonderful people. But again, I think they have to protect themselves and they're getting to know me a little bit better, but they don't know me that. I think they're concerned
Yeah.
about what's going to happen and how do they protect their own interests. And um, yeah, so it's
That
complicated,
is
but
okay. I want everyone to think of that when they have a challenge at work. At least you're not trying to find the bowhead whale ovary of a
ovaries.
140-year-old whale that's in someone's freezer that won't give it to you. I'm going to think about that tomorrow.
Yeah, in my mind, they just have ovaries sitting in their freezers. The reality is, and I discovered this, I was just there in December, those ovaries that are in the freezer may not be stored appropriately. I need to
Mm.
do experiments on this tissue and it requires it requires tissue that's been stored in a very particular way. So the what's been stored may not be worth anything to me, but they're hunting these whales continuously. So, you know,
There's hope.
uh,
And you'll be like,
yes.
please.
Yes. So
Oh, well, I hope
please,
you get that.
all of your listeners, please wish me luck.
Sending you really good vibes to get those big old ovaries. And then at the Buck Institute, I think whenever anyone thinks of cutting edge research, all they think of is ending menopause. And even I think when that was set up in 2018, I feel like that was when we learned about it, that was a little bit of the push is can we end menopause? And it's such a simple way of looking at it. And I know people are now freezing ovarian tissue in the hope of delaying menopause. And there's all sorts of great applications for that. This isn't your work, but you're there. Could you just give me a little bit of
Yeah.
background?
I think we're and I don't know about ending it. I do think it will be possible in our lifetime to delay it. I think we're still very far away from that. So when I say in our lifetime, like it's not in the next 5 years, maybe in the next 20 years. Ending menopause sounds very catchy. That's in the day to day of what we're doing. Like right now, what we're trying to do is just understand the problem, understand how aging of the ovary works, what is happening in the tissue, what is driving that aging, what is speeding it up. So, like, right now, we're like focused on basic things. So, it's not like we're like all in our labs testing drugs that are going to end. That sounds it's a very splashy headline, right? And I don't know, maybe at some point that will be possible. That's a huge question, not just a technical question, but also an ethical. That's a big question that requires a lot of conversation. And I'm a scientist, but I also am a human being who just has opinions about things, like personal opinions. I tend to be someone who avoids intervention unless I really need it. I don't know if I would personally myself ever end my own menopause if I had the option, but I do feel really strongly that women should have options. That's something that I feel very strongly about. Even if they don't exercise that, even if they don't take it, I think more options is better. And actually, when I look at the evolution of the animal world, like you see that everywhere. I talk about it in this book. Like females have actually evolved the ability to exercise choices, right? There's choice built into our system. So this is just a natural extension of that. Like more choice is good. Maybe it can be overwhelming. I think we need to understand ovarian aging. And I think if there would be a way to slow it down, I think that's worth investigating and something that some women might be interested in. Does that mean that all women need to cut half their ovary off and save it for later so that they can extend their ovary? No, of course not. These are very personal decisions. I myself, someone who is actively studying this, I'm in this research space, am not sure that I'm going to take hormone therapy. Again, these are very personal decisions. I'm sure that when IVF was first developed, I think it was around the time that I was born. So I don't remember I'm not aware of the sort of discussions that were happening at the time, but I'm sure many people said, this is totally unnatural. Why would we do that? But it is something that gives women a choice. Women who are not able to conceive naturally, it gives them the option to start a family or to grow a family. So
Yeah, let's not forget a lot of women are having very early menopause. There's all sorts of conditions. So it's
yes,
not just for the average person who's trying to anti-age, but
yes.
I saw an article over here that there's a clinic now that is helping you delay menopause by up to 10 years. And I thought a lot about, yeah. And I thought a lot about, yeah,
Wonder
I'd
how
like to
they're
look
wonder how they're doing it.
a keyhole surgery where they take some of your ovarian
Oh,
tissue and
yeah.
freeze it and then implant it later.
Yeah. Certainly a way to do it. I don't know that's something that a lot of women are going to want to do. It's pretty invasive.
I've seen a biohacker say that he's going to tell his daughter when she's in her 20s to do this. I was around for the whole egg freezing thing and I never got married or had kids. And so it was a bit too late for me to do it. But I have seen younger friends that did it. It's not as simple as it was put to us. Like
Oh
it's
yeah.
not, right? Like it's in the fullness of time. You got to have the fullness of time for a lot of this stuff. It seems
Oh
great, but we're
yes.
not going to know for 10 or 20 years what actually happens when you do that. And
Yes.
yeah, and you don't want to be an old fogey about it, but you're also like, I remember when everyone said egg freezing was the answer to
Yes.
everything. And I saw people.
No, I
Oh,
do
yeah.
feel that women were misled a little bit on the sort of egg freezing front.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. It's
Yeah.
not as easy to do and it doesn't work all the time, right?
No, it's expensive.
It's
You gotta keep
expensive.
it freezing, frozen. So
No,
anyway, it's
totally.
a lot of issues, but I agree with you that we need options. And to think that my mother and her generation only had the choice of basically being a nurse, a teacher, or a flight
Secretary.
attendant, secretary. That was
Yeah.
basic. And I'm flight attendant was barely anyone. So that was just you know,
Yeah.
something everyone wanted to be. And so to think, yes, of course we need and deserve options, and it's hard for people to understand. Okay, before I let you go, I want to talk about the grandmother hypothesis. This is going back
Yes.
again to like why we have menopause, but I
Yes.
think that's such a controversial theory. It's so interesting. You spoke about it really well. So can you just tell us what it is? Tell us why
Yeah.
there's issues with it. Tell us where you think you're at with it.
Yeah. So the idea of the grandmother hypothesis, it really, I think it was in the 1950s when the idea first came about, but it wasn't until the 1990s that a woman named Kristen Hawkes, she's an anthropologist, she really fleshed it out. And it came from her work with this Hadza tribe in Tanzania. So she was there observing the women in this tribe. And what she noticed is that a lot of the older Hadza grandmothers were really important in these small family communities. So they did a lot of the food preparation. So a big part of their diet are these tubers that need to be dug up and then processed in some way. I'm not sure exactly how they do it, but it's the grandmothers, the Hadza grandmothers that are doing the work. And then they do a lot of food sharing in these communities. And so a lot of that food processing, that food is then fed to the woman's grandchildren. Anyway, so these observations led her to this idea that the evolution, it wasn't exact. There's different versions of this hypothesis. The one that I think the most well known one, maybe the first one, was this idea. It wasn't about why menopause evolved, it was the idea of why human longevity evolved. And the idea is that humans started living longer because of these grandmothers. So essentially, even though the women in these communities, it's not the Hadza tribe, but it's some ancestral hunter gatherer tribe, these women who were going through menopause and living a little bit longer, even though they weren't reproducing, the ones who started engaging in these behaviors, so we can call it grandmothering to describe it in an easy way, the women who started engaging in grandmothering were more successful in a reproductive sense, in an evolutionary sense, not because they were reproducing themselves, but because they were boosting the success, the survival, and ultimately, the reproductive success of her kin. So more of her grandchildren were surviving, and then it just continues down the line, right? So she's passing on more of her genes essentially through her grandchildren. And
By
so,
keeping them robust, by keeping them healthy,
yeah, by
by
keeping
pitching
them
in, keeping
alive,
them alive.
right? More of them she's giving them that food. The grandmother who isn't doing that doesn't have as many grandchildren survive. And so that behavior of not being a grandmother don't get passed on. And the genes involved in grandmothering that are helping more of those grandchildren survive, those genes are then getting passed down through those grandchildren. And so that's how a trait like grandmothering becomes fixed in a population. It's a hypothesis about human longevity, the evolution of human longevity, that basically centers around grandmothers. It's really maternal grandmothers, and we don't need to get into the nitty gritty of it because it is complicated. And so that was the idea. And it was really provocative at the time because at the time, a lot of theories about human evolution and longevity and long childhoods, et cetera, really centered around men. And her hypothesis now centers it all around these maternal grandmothers. So there are other versions of the hypothesis that something slightly different, which is not just that we started living longer because of these grandmothers, but also that menopause itself had to happen because the grandmothers who were still reproducing would not been as successful at helping those grandchildren. For example, like in elephants are very matriarchal. The grandmothers are, it's a very social, these are very social communities. The grandmothers are involved in grandchildren's survival, but the females continue reproducing themselves. So they're doing it all. They're being mothers and they're being grandmothers. There are some versions of the grandmother hypothesis that say no, the women had to go through menopause and stop reproducing in order for any of this to pan out, in order for them to be able to help their grandchildren survive. Okay, so how do I feel about the hypothesis? What are the weaknesses? There are certainly weaknesses. One is when you look at human populations across the globe, there are certainly instances like in the Hadza community where the presence of a maternal grandmother boosts the survival of grandchildren. So having a grandmother alive in a community boosts survival of grandchildren. But then there are in some communities where it doesn't do anything, or it even is detrimental to survival of the grandchildren. So there's mixed support depending on what community you look in. I would also say, and this is always really hard for me to talk about, there are two anthropologists that I think did it really well. The names are going to escape me, but let me describe what they talk about in their paper. It was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago now. But there's something circular about the logic. The hypothesis claims that grandmothering led to the evolution of longer lives, but you need postmenopausal women alive to begin with for grandmothering behavior to evolve. So it's hard to imagine how grandmothering itself could have led to a longer life if the longer life didn't exist yet. I don't know if that makes sense, but so these two anthropologists that I just mentioned, they have a different take on the grandmother hypothesis, which actually makes a lot of sense to me. And the idea is longevity evolved for some other reason. They talk about it as self-domestication. So we know that many human behaviors were changing over the course of human evolution. So one of the things that changed was that humans became much more cooperative. There was more food sharing. There was more of a division of labor. There was more people involved in the group. You weren't just fending for yourself. There was, again, a division of labor and food sharing. And so they argue that as that happened, longevity increased. And then you had all of these women, these postmenopausal women, who this behavior could then evolve in those women. And behaviors clearly were changing. So this cooperative behavior on the part of grandmothers, like it would have been in the context of all the other changes, human behavioral changes that were happening. This is something that could have easily evolved in that context. But the crux of their argument is those postmenopausal women need to already exist for those grandmotherly behaviors to evolve. So it's really just a question of the order of how the traits evolved. And again, it comes down to math. Like we know that the way natural selection works, you need lots of numbers. You need big numbers of individuals in a population. And for this new behavior, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the evolution of a new behavior in humans, which is grandmothering. When you look at chimps, they don't grandmother. They could care less about their grandchildren, which is why this population in Uganda is so interesting, right? Because there is no grandmothering in this population, but there are now postmenopausal females. And so I think that's why it's so important to study these other animals. I think this could be a window into what happened in our species. Maybe a prerequisite for menopause to evolve is that longevity increases for some reason. And then that makes available to natural selection this new behavior to evolve.
Like it just hasn't evolved in those chimps because they're the only ones and there aren't enough of them? Is that would that follow on?
Yes. Chimps are also very different from humans behaviorally. So I don't know that it would ever evolve.
Why are chimps jerks? No, I'm just joking.
They're just less cooperative than
Right.
humans.
Interesting.
You know?
What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, this has nothing to do with anything except with your background. People will take something like the grandmother hypothesis, and I'm guilty of doing it too, and just run with it and be like, oh, we're here to spread our wisdom. And after menopause, I'm not going to lie, you feel really good. And you do feel like more able to take care of yourself and more able to give back. And I just wonder, I'm sure you've heard some of this. What do you think from your perch?
I'm really interested in, this is not my area of expertise, but when I wrote my book, you go down rabbit holes. And I knew a lot about some of the topics I was writing about, but some of them I hadn't actually ever really researched. The thing that I became really, there were a couple topics I became fascinated by, but one of them was human behavior. Again, that's not something I ever thought about. But as you think about human behaviors, there is a genetic component to them. I won't go down the rabbit hole of evolutionary psychology, and that's a very controversial field. But you can take something less controversial, like eating. When you're hungry and you eat something, it feels good, right? Your brain is telling you this feels good. I don't know, when you exercise, it can feel really good. When you have sex, it can feel really good, right? So there are certain basic behaviors that our brains tell us feel good. And that is an evolved response, right?
Mhm.
And I would put grandmothering in that category. Watch my mother and my mother-in-law engage with my kids, and I can see it in them. They feel good when they are doing certain things. I won't say that they like all of it. If you
Right.
dump the kids on them for days on end, they're like, have them back.
Yeah.
I'm done. But for those brief visits
Mhm.
or when they're buying them something, or it is a pleasure for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely something that evolved in our human ancestors at some point.
Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of variation. Some grandmothers could care less,
Yeah.
just the way that some mothers are not very engaged or some dads are not that engaged. But I think overall, as a human trait, that is something that is part of who we are.
Yeah.
And so whether it's the reason we live longer or it emerged after we started living longer, I absolutely think that sharing your wisdom and all of that brings a postmenopausal grandmother some pleasure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. This has been fascinating. Really, truly. I love talking
Yeah.
to you. And I'm really sending you good bowhead whale ovary vibes for
Thank you.
2025. It's your
I need
year.
them. I
Anything I
need
can do
them.
to help, please let me know.
It's funny you say that. I do tell this story to random people because you never
Never
know.
know.
Someone
No,
might know
no,
one of these whalers and
it's
say, hey, I
absolutely
can
true.
vouch for Deena.
It's
It hasn't happened
absolutely
yet. But
no.
maybe one of your listeners will know someone from the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission.
No, stranger
And
things have happened. Like, honestly, keep doing that work. This is really fascinating, and I'm so happy to have you and your perspectives and for saying women in the U.S. to all die at 50. That's nice to hear.
yes, yeah, if there's anything that you take from this, that your listeners take from this, take that away.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun.
Hot Flash Inc. was created and is hosted by Anne Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Anne Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hot Flash Inc. Media.